There are some cases that begin with a disappearance, and then there are cases like this one, where the disappearance is almost the least disturbing part, because when someone vanishes, there is usually a silence that follows, a gap, a stillness. Phones stop ringing, messages stop coming. The world pauses in a way that feels wrong, but final. In this case, that silence never came. A woman named Cari disappeared in 2012, but she did not seem to disappear. Not really. Her phone kept sending texts, her email kept firing off messages, her social media kept speaking in her name. For months, then years, the people around her were forced to live with a version of Cari who sounded angry, obsessive, threatening, unstable. It was as if she had vanished in person, but stayed behind digitally, haunting everyone who had known her. And that is what makes this case so hard to shake. Because the question was never just where did Cari go? The question became, who was still talking as her, and why? This story sits in that deeply unsettling place where intimacy turns into possession, where jealousy stops looking like jealousy and starts looking like erasure. And if you're into the kind of true crime cases that deserve to be heard far beyond the headlines, subscribe and stay with me, because this one is not just about murder. It is about replacing someone so completely that for a while, the truth almost suffocated under the performance. And before we get deeper into this, tell me where you're watching from tonight. I always want to know how far these stories travel, especially the ones that leave a mark. At the center of it all was a man named Dave Krupa. He was living in Nebraska, newly single after a long relationship, and by his own account, he was not looking for commitment. He was dating casually, keeping things light. One of the women he became involved with was Shanna Liz Golyar. Another was Cari Farver. For a short while, it looked like a messy but ordinary dating triangle. Nothing unique, nothing historic, nothing that should have ended with years of terror. But then came a morning in November 2012. Cari had spent the night with Dave. By the next day, she was gone. Not just gone from his apartment, gone from her son, gone from her mother, gone from work, gone from the ordinary obligations and routines that had structured her life. Yet almost immediately, her absence became tangled with a stream of messages that made her seem not like a missing woman, but like a woman who had snapped. And that shift changed everything. Because once a victim is made to look unstable, how much truth do people stop seeing? How much danger hides behind that label? And how easy is it to destroy someone once you've already rewritten their voice? That is where this story really begins. Not with a body, not with a confession, but with a message that made it sound like Cari was still very much alive. And that illusion would go on far longer than anyone should believe possible. Dave Krupa later said that after Cari left his apartment, he received a message from her that changed the entire tone of everything. According to him, she abruptly proposed something serious, something fast, something domestic, the kind of message that felt wildly out of step with the reality of a brief relationship. He pushed back, and almost instantly, the mood turned. Suddenly, the texts were hostile, emotional, aggressive. What had looked, hours earlier, like a casual connection now seemed to be morphing into obsession. From there, the messages escalated. The person claiming to be Cari started texting Dave relentlessly. Not just angry messages, but messages that felt invasive, erratic, controlling. They painted a picture of a woman who refused to let go, a woman spiraling after rejection. And if that had been all, it would still have been disturbing. But it did not stop with Dave. Other people began hearing from Cari too. Her mother, her friends, people connected to her life. Some messages implied she had left voluntarily. Some suggested she wanted distance. Some gave just enough explanation to postpone panic, but never enough to make real sense. That is one of the cruelest things about impersonation in cases like this. It does not need to be perfect. It just needs to buy time. It just needs to plant doubt. It just needs to keep everyone slightly off balance. But there was a problem. The real Cari Farver was a mother. She had a son she loved. She had a job. She had family ties. She had habits and responsibilities and routines. The version of her that now existed through texts and emails did not behave like a woman building a new life. She behaved like a woman burning her life down while narrating it in real time. And people who knew her began to feel it. Something was wrong. Her mother, Nancy, could not reconcile the messages with the daughter she knew. Imagine that for a second. Imagine receiving words from your child, but each message makes you feel farther away from them, not closer. Imagine being forced to wonder whether your daughter had changed beyond recognition, or whether someone, somewhere, was using her voice like a mask. How do you even begin to process that? Which is more terrifying, believing your loved one abandoned you or suspecting they never wrote any of it at all? Meanwhile, Dave was not just receiving texts. He was living through a sustained campaign of fear. Cari seemed to watch his movements, insert herself into his relationships, and erupt whenever he tried to move on. It was intimate in a way that only made sense if the sender understood his habits, his routines, his vulnerabilities. But instead of leading him toward clarity, that intimacy pushed him deeper into confusion. Because if the messages were truly from Cari, then she was somewhere out there, furious and fixated. And if they weren't, then someone close enough to know the details of his life was playing a much darker game. Shauna Golyer remained in the background, but not too far in the background. She was still around Dave, still part of the emotional landscape. In some ways, she appeared to be another target of Cari's harassment. That detail matters, because one of the most effective ways to hide behind a lie is to step inside it yourself, to become not the aggressor, but the fellow victim, to say, look, she's tormenting me too, to present yourself as frightened, wounded, sympathetic. It's a chilling strategy when it works, because it redirects scrutiny while deepening trust, and it seemed to work, at least for a while. The narrative that Cari was unstable took root. The messages kept coming, the pressure built, and the real woman at the center of it all remained physically absent, while the false version of her became louder and uglier by the week. That alone is terrifying. But what came next made the case feel less like a disappearance and more like a nightmare carefully managed from behind a screen. Because the messages did not fade after a few days. They did not stop after a few weeks. They continued, over and over, as if someone had made a decision not just to explain a disappearance, but to perform it indefinitely. As time passed, the situation around Dave Krupa grew stranger, then more frightening, then outright surreal. The messages from Cari did not behave like the last burst of emotion from someone going through a breakup. They behaved like a long-running siege. The tone shifted between rage and manipulation, jealousy and menace, desperation and control. It was as if one person had made herself impossible to escape while never physically appearing. And at some point, you have to ask, what kind of mind commits to something like that for years? Not days, not weeks, years. Dave later described living under constant pressure. He changed routines. He looked over his shoulder. He tried to understand whether the threat was mostly digital or whether it could become physical. And then signs began to appear that the danger was not limited to texts and emails. Property damage, fires, incidents that suggested someone was not just sending messages, but acting in the real world. The invisible hostility surrounding him started to feel embodied. One of the most disturbing aspects of this case is how thoroughly it weaponized ambiguity. If your car is vandalized while you are receiving threats, you naturally connect the two. If a home is set on fire after months of harassment, the fear becomes something else entirely. But if all of it is being blamed on a woman who has not been physically seen in ages, how do you prove what you are really facing? How do investigators separate what is true from what has been staged to look true? And how easy is it for a lie to grow teeth once people have already accepted its premise? Shauna was still in the picture, and in a way that complicated everything. She and Dave kept circling back to each other. Their relationship was inconsistent, but it never fully severed. She was present during periods of chaos. She was part of the emotional fallout. And crucially, she also appeared to be receiving harassment from Cari. It is hard to overstate how effective that can be. If the same unseen person is supposedly attacking both of you, then you and the other victim become bonded by fear. You stop asking whether the person beside you might be manufacturing the entire crisis. But there were details that did not sit right. Little contradictions, timing issues, things that felt off in a way that people sometimes ignore at first because the overall situation is already so bizarre. One of the strangest truths in criminal cases is that once a story becomes dramatic enough, absurd details can hide inside it, almost undetected. Everyone is so focused on the larger horror that they miss the seams. Cari's family, especially her mother, kept trying to hold on to what they knew of her. This was not a woman likely to abandon her child without explanation. This was not someone who simply floated away into a new life while maintaining a campaign of digital cruelty toward an ex-boyfriend. The story being told in Cari's name did not feel like her, but proving that is not simple. We live in a world where messages feel intimate, immediate, personal. We are trained to believe that if the phone lit up, the person was there. This case exploited that instinct in one of the cruelest ways imaginable. The impersonation also had a practical effect. It delayed the emotional clarity that often drives urgency in missing person cases. If a person seems to be sending emails, maybe they are not missing. If they are active online, maybe they left on purpose. If they are threatening people, maybe they do not want to be found. That fog is useful if someone is trying to erase a murder, but in this case, it became more than useful. It became its own form of violence. Think about what it means to lose someone, then watch their identity be turned against them. Think about what it means for a child to grow up with confusion around why his mother is gone. Think about what it means for a family to have grief delayed, distorted, contaminated by fake contact. There is something uniquely invasive about that. The victim is not allowed to rest. The family is not allowed to mourn properly. Even memory becomes unstable. And then the suspicion began to inch in a new direction. Why was there only noise and no substance? Messages, yes. Threats, yes. But where was the woman behind them? At some point, investigators started looking more closely at the digital trail itself, and once they did, the case began to transform. The messages that had once made Cari look unstable started to look like something else entirely. Not evidence of her presence, but evidence of someone's performance. And if that performance could be cracked, then the person hiding behind it might finally come into view. The shift in this case came when investigators stopped being hypnotized by the flood of messages and started asking a more disciplined question. Not what do these texts say, but where did they really come from? That distinction changed everything, because language can be faked, tone can be imitated, emotion can be staged. But digital behavior leaves patterns, and patterns do not care about performance. As law enforcement dug deeper, they began piecing together a reality far more disturbing than a jealous ex sending harassment. The communications attributed to Cari appeared increasingly tied not to a woman who had disappeared into another life, but to someone much closer to the center of the story. Someone with motive, someone with access, someone who had been standing in the chaos all along, insisting she was caught in it too. This is where the case starts to feel almost impossible in its psychological cruelty. Investigators came to believe that Cari Farver had not been alive during those years of messages at all, that she had likely been killed near the very beginning, and that the texts, emails, and online posts that followed were part of a sustained impersonation orchestrated to make it seem like she was still out there, still volatile, still dangerous. Can you imagine the level of calculation that requires? To kill someone and then keep speaking as them, over and over, to the people who loved them and the man you did not want them to have? The person investigators focused on was Shauna Liz Golyar, and once suspicion settled there, earlier events started rearranging themselves into a much darker shape. Her continued presence around Dave, her status as another supposed victim of Cari's harassment, the intimate knowledge embedded in the messages, the endurance of the campaign. Suddenly, it no longer looked random. It looked curated. Digital forensics became critical. Phone records, online accounts, message routing, location data, device usage, account recovery details, small technical fragments that do not seem emotional on their own. Yet, in a case like this, they become devastating. Because while a human voice can disguise itself, the infrastructure behind that voice often tells a different story. Investigators began connecting the communications to places, devices, and patterns associated not with Cari, but with Shauna. Then there was the issue of timing, that first burst of messages after Cari's last known movements, the sudden escalation, the convenient creation of a narrative in which Cari rejected ordinary life and transformed overnight into a digital predator. It was dramatic, yes, but it was also suspiciously useful. Useful to anyone who needed Cari's absence explained. Useful to anyone who wanted Dave frightened and emotionally dependent. Useful to anyone who wanted to remain close while directing all blame outward. There were also reports of physical incidents that increasingly pulled Shauna into focus. At one point, she herself was injured, and the event was presented in a way that fed the story that Cari was dangerous, but investigators began to question whether some of these incidents had been staged or manipulated. That is another chilling layer in this case. It was not enough to invent a villain. The villain had to feel real enough to justify the fear, real enough to command sympathy, real enough to keep everyone locked inside the story. And through all of this, the real Cari remained missing. No sightings, no independent proof of life, no meaningful trace of an actual living person moving through the world after that final day. Just words, just digital echoes, just a version of her that kept getting meaner, stranger, more threatening. It is one thing to steal someone's identity for money. It is another to steal their emotional existence and use it as a weapon. That is what makes this case feel so intimate in the worst possible way. It was not simply concealment, it was replacement. The evidence continued to build. Investigators eventually found links tying the false communications and related events back to Shauna. And once that structure started to hold, the case stopped being about whether Cari had vanished voluntarily. It became about murder, manipulation, obsession, and one woman allegedly trying to control the narrative so completely that everyone else would mistake theater for reality. But even then, one painful question lingered. If Cari had been dead almost from the beginning, then where was she? Where had her body gone? Because until that part of the story was answered, the case still carried the awful, unresolved feeling of a voice speaking without a body. And the truth about what happened to Cari was waiting in a place both ordinary and horrifying. Years into the investigation, a breakthrough came that pushed the case from terrifying theory into devastating fact. Human remains were discovered, and investigators ultimately identified them as Cari Farver. The discovery was the kind of moment that ends one kind of uncertainty and begins another. Because once Cari was found, no one could keep pretending she had simply walked away. No one could keep giving the digital ghost the benefit of the doubt. The messages were no longer strange clues. They were evidence of something monstrous. Finding Cari's remains mattered not only because it confirmed death, but because it restored reality. For years, the case had been warped by that manufactured online presence. Cari had been turned into a character in someone else's script, erratic, obsessive, threatening. The recovery of her remains cut through that lie in the starkest possible way. She was not out there composing cruel messages. She was gone. She had been gone. The person speaking as her had been stealing time from everyone who loved her. By then, investigators had amassed a broader picture of Shauna Golyar's behavior, and it was deeply disturbing. This was no impulsive cover-up that unraveled in a week. This was a prolonged campaign of impersonation and harassment. It touched multiple platforms. It spread across years. It infiltrated relationships. It manipulated emotions. It kept Dave trapped in fear and confusion, and kept Cari's family suspended in a kind of grief that could not settle because the victim's name kept reappearing in their inboxes. That is one of the hardest things to sit with in this story. Most killers try to create distance from the victim after the crime. Here, investigators said the opposite happened. The alleged killer stayed close by becoming her, or rather, by becoming a twisted version of her. A version designed to satisfy jealousy, preserve access, and destroy sympathy. What does it say about a person if eliminating someone is not enough? If they also need to inhabit that person's identity and rewrite how the world sees them? There was evidence suggesting a deep possessiveness at the core of it all. Dave had been casually seeing both women. Shauna had a connection to him. Cari briefly entered that orbit, and then she disappeared. On the surface, it sounds like the kind of interpersonal conflict people dismiss too easily, as if jealousy is too ordinary to become this extreme. But jealousy is only the beginning. Cases like this are about control, about narrative, about the inability to tolerate another person existing in a place you believe should belong to you. And in that mindset, the victim does not merely need to be removed. She needs to be overwritten. As prosecutors laid out the case, the scale of the alleged impersonation became one of its most shocking features. The messages were not random bursts. They were sustained, strategic, and often chillingly personal. They kept Dave in emotional captivity. They made authorities hesitate. They distorted how others understood Cari's disappearance, and they may have bought the killer years. Years in which the victim's own voice, or what sounded like it, was used to help bury her. There were also deeply unsettling physical elements in the evidence against Shauna. Investigators found connections that went beyond the digital world and suggested a capacity for real-world staging and violence. The prosecution's case presented not an isolated deceit, but an entire ecosystem of lies, threats, and manufactured events. Bit by bit, the image that emerged was not of a frightened woman being targeted by an obsessed rival, but of a woman allegedly constructing the rival herself. And still, the emotional center of the case remains Cari, a mother, a daughter, a woman whose last days were swallowed by someone else's obsession. It is easy, in high-profile true crime, for the manipulative brilliance of a cover-up to overshadow the person it erased. But that is exactly what the cover-up wanted. So every time this story is told, I think it matters to return to the same truth. Cari Farver was not the unstable phantom these messages made her out to be. She was the victim, and for years, even her own absence was manipulated against her. Once the case reached court, the prosecution faced the challenge of explaining something that sounded almost too strange to be real. A murder followed by years of digital impersonation. A romantic rivalry transformed into a campaign of psychological terror. A victim not only silenced, but repurposed. In some cases, juries struggle with complexity. In this one, the complexity was the crime. To understand the murder, you had to understand the performance built around it. At trial, prosecutors argued that Shana Golyar killed Cari Farver and then used Cari's phone, accounts, and identity to make it appear that she was alive and obsessively targeting Dave Krupa and others. The alleged motive was rooted in possessiveness and fixation. The relationship dynamics mattered because they explained why Cari became the threat to be removed. But the real shock came from what happened after. Prosecutors described an extended deception designed not just to conceal murder, but to control everyone's emotional reality. Digital evidence played a major role. It helped show where messages originated, how accounts were used, and how the false narrative had been maintained. This was one of those rare cases where technology did not simply document the aftermath of a crime. Technology was the stage on which the aftermath had been performed, and once that stage was examined carefully, it no longer protected the illusion, it exposed it. The defense pushed back, as defenses do. But the prosecution's picture was powerful because it tied together motive, access, behavior, and digital trace evidence in a way that gave coherence to years of chaos. The same chaos that once made the case confusing now made it persuasive, because who but the architect of the deception could have sustained it so intimately for so long? Courtroom proceedings in cases like this often bring out a different kind of horror. Not the immediate horror of violence, but the cold horror of hearing months and years reduced to records, dates, account logs, and witness statements. One message after another, one act after another, one manipulation after another. It forces everyone in the room to confront not just what was done, but how deliberately it was maintained. And maybe that is why this case stays with so many people. The violence did not end with the murder. It kept echoing through every fake text, every threatening email, every attempt to make Cari villain of her own disappearance. The jury ultimately convicted Shana Golyar of murder. It was a verdict that gave legal form to what investigators had painstakingly assembled, that Cari Farver had been killed, and that the years of messages were not proof of her life, but proof of the extraordinary lengths someone went to in order to erase her and occupy the space she left behind. Even after conviction, though, the emotional questions do not disappear. What does justice mean in a case where the victim's identity was exploited for years? What does closure look like when a family has had to grieve not only a murder, but the ongoing contamination of memory? Can a verdict fully undo the confusion that was deliberately planted? Probably not. But it can restore one essential thing. It can restore the right story. And in a case built on replacing the truth, that matters more than ever. There is something especially haunting about crimes that unfold through ordinary tools. A phone, an inbox, a social media account. Things all of us use without thinking. We tend to associate horror with obvious danger, with isolated roads and dark rooms and visible threats. But this case reminds us that terror can arrive as a notification. It can sound like a familiar name. It can sit in your pocket and vibrate. It can make you flinch not because you do not know who is contacting you, but because you think you do. That is why the storytelling angle in this case is so powerful and so deeply disturbing. She vanished, and then she kept speaking. Or at least that is what everyone was supposed to believe. The killer, prosecutors said, did not just want Cari gone. She wanted control over what Cari meant after death. She wanted to shape how others felt about her, to make Dave fear her, to make her family doubt her, to place herself, subtly but constantly, at the emotional center of the storm. And when you think about it, that may be the most intimate form of violence in the entire case. Not simply taking a life, but hijacking a presence, turning the victim into the instrument of her own disappearance. How do you defend yourself against that? Especially when you are no longer here to speak. How does a family protect the memory of someone they love when messages keep arriving in her name, each one making her seem less like herself? For Dave, the case meant years of living inside confusion, fear, and manipulation. For Cari's family, it meant years of uncertainty sharpened by false contact. For investigators, it meant untangling a narrative that had been designed to resist untangling. And for anyone hearing the story now, it leaves behind a very modern kind of dread. Because most of us are used to thinking of identity as something stable. In this case, identity became a crime scene. Cari should have been remembered as herself from the beginning. A real woman, a mother, a daughter, a person with a life that mattered. Instead, for years, her name was turned into a weapon. That is why I think this case lands so hard with people who follow psychological true crime. It is not just about betrayal by someone close. It is about appropriation, about obsession so consuming that it reaches beyond murder into authorship, into deciding who gets to tell the story of a life and who gets erased from it. And maybe that is the question this case leaves us with. Not just how someone could do this, but how often we mistake noise for truth. How quickly we accept the version of a person that arrives through screens, especially when it is dramatic, volatile, easy to believe. How often the loudest voice wins, even when the real person can no longer answer back. In the end, Cari Farver did not keep texting for years. Someone kept using her to speak, and that difference is everything. Because once you understand it, the case stops being a bizarre digital mystery and becomes what it always was underneath, a deeply personal act of jealousy, control, and erasure, carried out with terrifying patience. This is one of those cases that lingers after the video ends. Not because it is flashy, not because it is full of twists for the sake of twists, but because it reaches into something very intimate and very current, the fear that someone can take your place in the story, and for a while, the world might believe them. And when the truth finally comes out, it does not just expose a killer, it reveals how close the lie came to winning. So when you think about Cari tonight, do not think first about the messages. Think about the silence underneath them. The silence that should have told everyone much sooner that something was terribly wrong. And maybe ask yourself this: if someone you loved vanished, but their phone kept lighting up, would you know the difference between a message and a mask?